German officers posted along the French coast could hardly believe what they were seeing at dawn on June 6, 1944. The horizon across the English Channel was filled with ships, thousands of them, stretching farther than the eye could follow. Above, the sky thundered with enormous formations of Allied aircraft. The scale of the operation shattered everything German commanders had expected. It was Sunday morning, yet the scene unfolding before them revealed a level of military organization and industrial power that Nazi leaders had never anticipated. This was not the weak and divided United States portrayed for years in German propaganda. What the officers were witnessing was the immense production and logistical capacity of an industrial superpower fully mobilized for war. 2 weeks later, the German commander in the West, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, delivered a detailed assessment of the Allied invasion. In a report exceeding 3,000 words, he identified the central reason for the success of the landings. The Allies dominated the skies completely. Within just 2.5 days, Allied air forces carried out roughly 29,000 sorties. Every day, about 2,300 aircraft bombed, strafed, and patrolled the battlefield. Movement on the ground had become extremely dangerous. Even a lone soldier could be spotted and attacked. According to the report, moving tanks across open terrain during daylight had essentially become impossible. What Rundstedt observed on that June morning was the visible consequence of a massive strategic misjudgment by Nazi leadership. An error rooted in ideological beliefs that had taken shape years earlier, described American society as racially mixed and culturally fragmented, arguing that such a country could never remain united for long. In his view, the nation was built entirely on money and lacked deeper foundations. These remarks were not simply offhand opinions. They reflected a central pillar of Nazi ideology, the belief that racial purity created strength while diversity produced weakness. This assumption strongly influenced German strategic thinking. Hitler had voiced similar arguments publicly just a month earlier. On December 11, 1941, while addressing the Reichstag to announce war against the United States, he claimed that American achievements were admired only by those he considered culturally inferior. To him, the United States represented a society in decline, shaped by racial mixing rather than a unified national identity. The leadership of the Third Reich genuinely embraced these theories. They believed that Jewish influence corrupted governments, that democratic systems made countries militarily weak, and that racial diversity undermined national cohesion. These ideas were not merely propaganda directed at the public. They also shaped how German leaders evaluated their enemies. For years, Nazi media had portrayed the United States as a civilization in decay. Joseph Goebbels led a continuous propaganda campaign through his weekly publication Das Reich. In an August 1942 article, he mocked America as a country that would revert to wilderness if left without European influence. He contrasted MacArthur with German officers who had continued resisting even after being surrounded, portraying American commanders as products of Hollywood mythology rather than real warfare. Other senior figures echoed similar views. Hermann Goering, head of the German Air Force, once remarked that Americans were good at producing household appliances, but incapable of building the weapons required for modern war. According to him, the United States could manufacture refrigerators and razor blades, but not the equipment needed to defeat Germany. Such statements were not only rhetorical exaggerations. Many within the Nazi leadership genuinely believed that American industry lacked the sophistication necessary for large-scale military production. Propaganda repeatedly emphasized several themes. America was described as racially mixed and therefore internally weak. Its government was portrayed as manipulated by Jewish financiers. Capitalist inequality was said to divide the population. German newspapers published caricatures of Franklin D. Roosevelt with exaggerated features meant to suggest he served international conspirators. Magazine illustrations depicted American cities as morally corrupted places filled with jazz music and social decay, elements the Nazis associated with African American culture. The narrative appealed to those already committed to Nazi racial doctrine. In their view, a society lacking a single ethnic identity could never mobilize effectively for war. By contrast, they believed the German Reich possessed both racial unity and ideological discipline. Traditions. Privately, Hitler expressed open contempt for American capabilities. He mocked the idea that a society focused on consumer goods, entertainment, and Hollywood films could develop the discipline required for total war. His worldview left little room for the possibility that a diverse democracy might possess advantages his authoritarian system lacked. When Germany formally declared war on the United States in December 1941, only 4 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Hitler considered the decision almost inevitable. He believed the United States had already been assisting Britain through programs such as Lend-Lease and through naval operations in the Atlantic. Yet his strategic calculation contained a critical flaw. Hitler assumed that American resources would be consumed by war against Japan in the Pacific. Under this assumption, he believed the United States would be unable to send major forces to Europe for several years. By then, he expected Germany to have defeated the Soviet Union and secured control over the continent. German planners created long lists of supposed American weaknesses: limited combat experience, an inexperienced officer corps, inadequate armored forces, and insufficient strategic bombers. What they overlooked was that many of these weaknesses were temporary. America's real advantages, vast natural resources, immense industrial capacity, and a large population, were structural and long-term. Throughout 1942 and early 1943, however, German commanders began to notice developments that challenged these assumptions. Reports from the North African campaign suggested that American forces, although inexperienced at first, were improving rapidly. Casualty numbers seemed to validate the stereotypes promoted by Nazi propaganda. U.S. forces suffered over 6,000 casualties, while German losses were far smaller. In addition, American equipment losses included tanks, artillery, trucks, and large supplies of fuel and ammunition. Nazi media quickly presented the battle as proof that American soldiers lacked courage and discipline. Newspapers claimed that U.S. troops fled when confronted by experienced German fighters. Radio broadcasts repeated the argument that a racially mixed society could not match the determination of what they called a warrior nation. Yet experienced officers saw the situation differently. Rommel himself observed that American units recovered quickly after the initial shock. In his notes, he acknowledged that U.S. commanders reorganized their defenses efficiently and managed to halt further German advances by concentrating reserves at critical mountain passes. In later reflections, Rommel went even further. He recognized that American generals demonstrated strong tactical understanding and adaptability, although the most impressive examples of U.S. Mobile warfare would appear later in Europe under commanders such as George S. Patton. The early signs were already visible. Perhaps most concerning for Germany was the sheer volume of American equipment arriving at the front. Within only 3 months of the defeat at Kasserine Pass, the situation in North Africa had completely changed. By May 1943, Allied forces had driven Axis armies out of the region. The defining strengths of the United States during the war was its capacity to adjust after setbacks. Defeat did not paralyze the system. Instead, it triggered rapid reorganization and an even stronger return. This kind of flexibility was something rigid authoritarian regimes found difficult to replicate. Even as Nazi propaganda continued ridiculing American industry, the actual scale of production unfolding across the Atlantic was almost impossible for German observers to believe. Intelligence officers who reported the true figures were sometimes suspected of exaggeration or even spreading defeatism. Yet the statistics were accurate, and they kept increasing. In 1943 alone, American factories produced 29,497 tanks. When other armored vehicles are included, the total number of armored fighting vehicles reached 37,198 units that year. To understand the scale, consider that Germany manufactured 26,925 tanks during the entire war from 1939 to 1945. In other words, the United States produced more tanks in a single year than Germany managed across 6 years of total war. The American M4 Sherman tank became a powerful symbol of this imbalance. Early in the war, German crews dismissed it as inferior to their Panzer IV and a heavily armored Tiger tanks. On paper, the criticism seemed justified. The Sherman's armor was thinner, its main gun less powerful, and it had a reputation for catching fire after being penetrated. In terms of reliability, they even judged it superior to many German tanks. One engineer described it as an automotive achievement the German industry could only wish it had the capacity to produce. What German tankers often overlooked was the strategic significance of mass production. For every Tiger tank assembled in Germany, American factories were turning out dozens of Shermans. In a single tank duel, superior armor or firepower could make the difference, but wars are decided by campaigns, and campaigns are shaped by numbers. A Tiger might destroy several Shermans before being knocked out, yet if 20 Shermans were available for every Tiger, the mathematics of attrition strongly favored the Allies. German units themselves occasionally acknowledged this reality. Captured Shermans were sometimes reused by German forces, especially after being converted into armored recovery vehicles. Maintenance crews in Italy preferred them because their mechanical reliability was far better than many German machines, which frequently broke down. A war diary from the German Afrika Korps, dated November 2, 1942, even noted that American-built tanks possessed advantages in long-distance firefights, successfully engaging targets beyond 1,000 meters. Aircraft production revealed an even greater imbalance. During 1943, the United States manufactured 84,853 aircraft, including 9,574 heavy bombers, 7,256 medium bombers, and 23,621 fighters. The following year, output reached its peak, with 96,270 aircraft produced. Cultural icon known as Rosie the Riveter symbolized hundreds of thousands of real workers whose efforts made Allied air dominance possible. A striking example of industrial transformation was the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant in Michigan, created specifically to mass-produce B-24 Liberator bombers. Covering roughly 3.5 million square feet, it became the largest single industrial building under one roof in the world at that time. At its peak, about 42,000 employees worked there, more than 15,000 of them women. The B-24 itself was an extremely complicated aircraft, made up of around 1,550,000 components, compared with roughly 15,000 parts in a typical car. Yet Ford adapted automotive assembly line methods to aircraft construction, achieving production rates previously considered impossible. By 1944, the plant could complete a fully assembled Liberator every 63 minutes. In April 1944, monthly output reached 428 bombers. By the end of production, Willow Run had delivered 8,685 B-24s, nearly half of all Liberators built worldwide. These bombers played a crucial role in the Allied war effort. They devastated German industrial facilities, disrupted transportation networks, and helped secure the air superiority required for the D-Day invasion. In this sense, the factory workers building aircraft in Michigan were as much participants in the war as the crews flying them over Europe. Shipbuilding displayed similar industrial ingenuity. The Liberty ship program transformed cargo ship construction through mass production techniques championed by industrialist Henry Kaiser. Although some finishing work was completed afterward, the achievement illustrated the remarkable speed American shipyards had reached. By 1943, the United States was launching 3 Liberty ships every day. Over the course of the war, 2,710 of these cargo vessels were produced. They carried the lifeblood of Allied military operations. Tanks, trucks, ammunition, food, fuel, and the enormous quantities of equipment required for modern warfare. German U-boats sank large numbers of Allied merchant ships, but American shipyards replaced them faster than submarines could destroy them. The strategy of starving Britain through submarine warfare, championed by Admiral Karl Dönitz, gradually collapsed under the overwhelming volume of new ships entering service. American industrial power extended far beyond a few categories. By 1944, the United States was responsible for roughly 2/3 of all Allied military production. Its factories ultimately produced about 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, and nearly 2 million military trucks. By the end of the war, more than half of the world's total industrial output came from the United States. American artillery, in particular, left a strong impression on German commanders who encountered it in combat. During the Battle of Kasserine Pass, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel wrote to his wife on February 18, 1943, describing the effectiveness of American fire support. Observation aircraft directed the fire of multiple artillery batteries against every valuable target across the battlefield. Infantry and lightly armored vehicles. As a result, many German soldiers came to fear American artillery more than almost any other Allied weapon. The sheer volume of shells available allowed U.S. batteries to maintain firing rates that German gunners simply could not match. At the individual soldier level, the M1 Garand rifle provided American infantrymen with a significant advantage. Unlike the German Kar 98K Mauser, which required manual bolt operation after each shot, the M1 was semi-automatic. This allowed U.S. riflemen to fire rapidly and maintain sustained fire without breaking their shooting position. German units attempted to offset this disadvantage by deploying larger numbers of machine guns and submachine guns, but the Garand still gave American infantry greater individual firepower. General George S. Patton famously described the M1 Garand as the greatest battle implement ever devised. Despite these realities, Nazi ideology had long insisted that American industrial strength was exaggerated propaganda. According to this worldview, American workers were supposedly too comfortable and undisciplined to equal German productivity, while racial diversity and what Nazi leaders described as Jewish influence had supposedly weakened American society. The unfolding events of the war would prove those assumptions dramatically wrong. Every one of those assumptions ultimately collapsed. The Nazi leadership believed American democracy was chaotic and weak, yet it proved far more durable and flexible than Germany's rigid dictatorship. What appeared to them as disorder was actually a system capable of adapting quickly under pressure. Diversity became a major source of strength. The individuals who helped create and operate what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy represented a wide range of backgrounds and cultures. Many of them were people whom Hitler's racial theories labeled inferior. African Americans. Equally misunderstood was the diversity of American society. Nazi ideology treated racial diversity as a fatal flaw. In reality, that icon soldiers in particular disproved those claims through their actions in combat. Nazi propaganda had portrayed Black Americans as incapable and primitive. Yet, on battlefields throughout Europe, they demonstrated discipline, skill, and courage. The Tuskegee Airmen became one of the clearest examples. Between 1941 and 1946, 992 pilots completed training. Of those, 450 were deployed overseas, carrying out 1,578 combat missions and more than 15,000 individual sorties. They destroyed 112 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, eliminated another 150 on the ground, and damaged 148 more. Their escort record was especially impressive. Only 27 bombers were lost during missions under their protection, compared with an average of 46 for other P-51 escort units. It was the lowest loss rate among escort fighter groups. Forward, they remained in combat for 183 continuous days. During that period, they participated in 4 major Allied campaigns. The battalion helped break through the Siegfried Line, liberated more than 30 towns, and eventually advanced far enough east to link up with Soviet forces in Austria. Their operations were costly. Casualties approached 50%, yet their attacks inflicted an estimated 130,000 losses on German forces. Recognition came slowly. The battalion ultimately received 1 Medal of Honor, awarded decades later in 1997, along with 11 Silver Stars and roughly 300 Purple Hearts. A Presidential Unit Citation was granted in 1978, more than 30 years after the war. Even Patton, who earlier in his career had expressed openly racist views, came to value the battalion's fighting ability and used them in critical operations. The 92nd Infantry Division provided another example of African American combat service in Europe. This formation, about 15,000 officers and enlisted soldiers, fought in the Italian campaign from October 1944 until the war ended in May 1945. Their campaign was costly. Roughly 3,000 casualties were recorded, more than 400 killed, around 1,500 wounded, and approximately 500 missing or captured. Despite those losses, the division received 2 Medals of Honor, both finally awarded in 1997, as well as 208 Silver Stars, 1,166 Bronze Stars, and nearly 1,900 Purple Hearts. Among their achievements was the liberation of the Italian cities of La Spezia and Genoa. Over just 82 days, from August 25 to November 16, 1944, the system transported more than 412,000 tons of supplies from the Normandy beaches to advancing Allied armies. At its peak, nearly 6,000 trucks carried around 12,500 tons of fuel, ammunition, and equipment each day. Drivers operated continuously in rotating shifts, often pushing forward despite exhaustion. General Patton famously described the standard 2.5-ton truck as our most valuable weapon, acknowledging that his rapid advance across France depended entirely on that flow of supplies. Without the largely black drivers of the Red Ball Express, Patton's armored columns would have run out of fuel and ammunition within days. In total, between 1 million and 1.2 million African Americans served in the U.S. Armed forces during World War II, out of roughly 2.5 million registered for the draft. About 1 million served in the Army, 67,000 in the Navy, 17,000 in the Marine Corps, and around 4,000 African American women joined the Women's Army Corps. These service members fought for a country that still maintained segregation in its military. They endured discrimination even while risking their lives in uniform. Nevertheless, their performance consistently contradicted the racist assumptions promoted by Nazi ideology. Their actions proved that they were not inferior, but capable soldiers defending their nation. Another group Hitler had driven away would also contribute to the Allied victory in an unexpected way: controlled nuclear chain reaction. Others, including Edward Teller, Hans Bethe, Niels Bohr, John von Neumann, and Richard Feynman, were among the many refugee scientists whose expertise proved invaluable. Ironically, Nazi racial policies had forced much of this talent into exile. Many of the researchers working on the Manhattan Project were Jewish refugees from Germany, Hungary, or Austria. Hitler's ideology had pushed them out of Europe, only for them to contribute their knowledge to the United States. The result was a powerful scientific collaboration that eventually produced the most destructive weapon ever created. In effect, the Nazi regime had expelled the very scientists who might have helped them develop atomic weapons first. Another unlikely advantage came from Native American servicemen. Code Talkers used indigenous languages to create battlefield communication systems that enemy intelligence could not decipher. Roughly 400 to 420 Navajo Marines formed the largest group. They developed a complex code derived from their language that Japanese cryptographers, among the most skilled in the world, could never break. In fact, many could not even identify the language being used. During the Battle of Iwo Jima, 6 Navajo Code Talkers transmitted more than 800 messages in the first 48 hours alone, all without a single error. Major Howard Connor, the Marine Corps signal officer there, later stated bluntly that the Marines would likely not have captured the island without them. The Navajo were not alone. About 534 Native American Code Talkers from 14 or 15 tribes served in different theaters of the war. Once again, individuals whom racist ideology dismissed as inferior demonstrated capabilities that enemy intelligence could not overcome. Japanese Americans offered another powerful example of loyalty. Even while their families were confined in internment camps inside the United States, thousands volunteered for military service. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, composed largely of Japanese Americans, eventually became the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in U.S. military history. Its record was remarkable: 21 Medals of Honor, 20 of which were upgraded in 2001, along with 29 Distinguished Service Crosses, 560 Silver Stars, more than 4,000 Bronze Stars, and nearly 9,500 Purple Hearts. In total, the soldiers of the 442nd earned over 18,000 individual decorations. The cost of those achievements was enormous. The unit suffered a casualty rate of about 314%, meaning it had to be rebuilt more than 3 times during the war. From an original strength of roughly 4,000 soldiers, between 14,000 and 18,000 eventually served in the unit. More than 680 were killed in action. One of their most famous actions occurred in October 1944. A battalion from the 141st Regiment of the 36th Texas Division became trapped by German forces in the Vosges Mountains. The 442nd was ordered to fight through heavily defended positions and rescue them. Of people from many backgrounds, individuals whose abilities and determination proved far stronger than the theories that sought to diminish them. By the end of one brutal engagement, Company I had been reduced to only 8 active riflemen. Despite devastating losses, the unit earned 5 Presidential Unit citations within just 20 days, recognition tied to operations later counted among the 10 most significant battles in U.S. Army history. Many of the soldiers involved were Japanese Americans. Their bravery carried a painful irony. While they fought in Europe with extraordinary dedication, their families remained confined behind barbed wire in internment camps across the western United States. Their motivation was not the result of fair treatment by their country. Instead, they fought because they believed in it, and because they were determined to prove their loyalty beyond doubt. Nazi ideology claimed that racial diversity weakened nations, and that societies built on ethnic mixture could never match the strength of racially pure states. The record of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team shattered that claim. Their performance demonstrated that courage, discipline, and loyalty are not determined by racial background. Another community that served in large numbers was Hispanic Americans. Although they represented a smaller share of the national population, roughly 400,000 to 500,000 Hispanic Americans joined the U.S. military during the war. One notable formation was Company E of the 141st Infantry Regiment, part of the 36th Infantry Division. This company was composed almost entirely of Mexican-American soldiers from El Paso, Texas. The engagement effectively destroyed the company and became one of the most costly river assaults of the war. Yet the survivors continued fighting in later operations, including the bloody battles around Monte Cassino, proving a level of persistence and bravery equal to any American unit in the theater, while soldiers fought overseas. A different transformation was taking place inside the United States. Women dramatically reshaped American wartime industry. Before the war, women made up about 27% of the workforce. By 1945, their share had grown to roughly 36–37%. During the war years alone, about 6 million women entered the labor force. The shift was particularly striking in aircraft production. Before the conflict, women represented only about 1% of workers in that sector. By 1943, they accounted for around 65% of the workforce. At the massive Willow Run plant, which produced B-24 bombers, women made up as much as 1/3 of the 42,000 employees. More than 15,000 female workers participated in assembling the aircraft that later supported Allied operations from Normandy to the rest of occupied Europe. These workers were far more than symbolic figures. They mastered demanding technical skills, operating heavy industrial equipment, interpreting complex engineering diagrams, and performing precision quality checks on sophisticated weapon systems. The popular image of Rosie the Riveter reflected a real workforce with real expertise. Women welded structural components, installed wiring systems, assembled aircraft engines, and conducted testing procedures. Supplier for its allies. The scale of support provided to Britain and the Soviet Union demonstrated a level of industrial strength that German planners had once dismissed as impossible. Britain alone received more than $31 billion in assistance, a figure equivalent to roughly $540 billion today. The shipments included aircraft, armored vehicles, trucks, food supplies, raw materials, and industrial machinery. These deliveries were essential to Britain's ability to continue the war after 1941. Royal Air Force squadrons flew American-built aircraft, British troops relied on American trucks for transport, and civilians consumed food shipped from across the Atlantic. Factories in Britain also used American raw materials to manufacture weapons. The Soviet Union received over $11 billion in aid, worth roughly $190 billion in modern terms. Deliveries included 49,000 trucks and jeeps, 12,000 armored vehicles, among them 7,000 tanks, and 11,000 aircraft. Food shipments totaled 1.75 million tons, enough to provide every Soviet soldier with about half a pound of food per day throughout the war. The United States also supplied 15 million pairs of boots and 13 million winter coats. After the war, Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who led the Soviet forces that captured Berlin, acknowledged the importance of this support. Without American trucks, he admitted, the Red Army would have lacked the vehicles needed to move its artillery. In many of the great Soviet offensives between 1943 and 1945, mobility depended heavily on American-built Studebaker trucks. This arrangement allowed Soviet industry to focus primarily on tanks and artillery, while American manufacturing provided transport vehicles and logistical support. Even Joseph Stalin, despite his uneasy relationship with the Western powers, raised a toast in 1943, acknowledging that without American production, the Allies might have lost the war. While such statements may have carried diplomatic exaggeration, the underlying reality was difficult to deny. The United States was supplying multiple Allied nations while simultaneously deploying massive forces against both Germany and Japan. German intelligence officers were aware of many of these statistics. Reports detailing American industrial output and Lend-Lease shipments circulated within military intelligence. However, Nazi ideology shaped how these reports were interpreted. Many leaders assumed the figures had been inflated for propaganda purposes. Others argued that American equipment must be poorly manufactured or unreliable. Some believed that the Allied coalition, especially the partnership between capitalist democracies and the Communist Soviet Union, would eventually collapse under internal tensions. In practice, every one of these assumptions proved incorrect. American production figures were often accurate and sometimes even understated. The quality of American equipment was generally high, and in many cases it was more reliable and easier to mass-produce than German equivalents. Despite political disagreements, the Allied powers maintained cooperation because each recognized that defeating Nazi Germany was a matter of survival. Accurate, yet at many levels of command, ideological assumptions filtered how the information was received. Reports describing American industrial output were frequently dismissed as exaggerations. When analysts reported that the United States had produced nearly 30,000 tanks in 1943 alone, senior commanders refused to accept the number. Such a figure exceeded the total number of tanks Germany produced during the entire war. Many officers concluded that the statistic must include training vehicles or outdated equipment rather than combat-ready machines. Similarly, aerial reconnaissance photographed vast rows of Liberty ships in American harbors. Although the images were real, their significance was minimized. Some German officers suggested that ships built so quickly must be poorly constructed and likely to fail in rough seas. Naval intelligence officers who had examined captured American equipment knew otherwise. Nevertheless, at higher decision-making levels, ideological beliefs often outweighed empirical evidence. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, continued producing detailed assessments during the war. Its leader, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, gradually became disillusioned with the Nazi regime. Yet, even when his organization delivered accurate information, it was frequently ignored whenever it conflicted with the regime's assumptions about enemy weakness. By 1944, intelligence that might have helped Germany respond more effectively to Allied operations was often dismissed or reshaped to fit ideological expectations. This tendency to reject uncomfortable evidence is not unique to Nazi Germany. But the consequences in this case were particularly severe. Nazi leadership repeatedly chose to reject the facts. Their ideology claimed that racial mixing weakened societies, that soldiers from diverse backgrounds would lack cohesion, that Jewish influence undermined nations, and that women should remain confined to traditional domestic roles. The wartime experience of the United States contradicted each of these ideas. The diversity that Nazi theorists mocked became a practical advantage. American forces drew strength from communities of many different backgrounds. Even Japanese-American soldiers, fluent in Japanese, served in military intelligence roles, translating captured documents and intercepted communications. Skills that proved extremely valuable in the Pacific War. In the end, the rigid assumptions of Nazi racial doctrine collided with a far more complex reality. One in which diversity, industrial flexibility, and broad social participation became powerful tools of wartime success. During the Second World War, the United States drew strength from the diversity of its population. Navajo Marines created an unbreakable code that ensured secure battlefield communications. Jewish refugee scientists played a key role in developing the atomic bomb. African-American truck drivers maintained the massive logistical network that kept Allied forces supplied with fuel, ammunition, and food. Meanwhile, millions of American women worked in factories, producing the aircraft and ships that ultimately secured Allied control of the skies and seas. Hispanic American soldiers fought and died in the harsh mountains of Italy, transform it into an industrial and military giant Germany could not match. Long before the Allied landings in France, Germany had already felt the force of American industrial power through the strategic bombing campaign. Beginning in 1943, American B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators launched daylight bombing raids against German cities and factories, while British bombers attacked at night. The U.S. 8th Air Force, operating from bases in England, expanded dramatically, from a small formation in 1942 to a massive force of more than 200,000 personnel and thousands of heavy bombers by 1944. In major operations, the 8th Air Force could send over 1,000 bombers in a single mission, protected by hundreds of long-range P-51 Mustang fighters. Each bomber carried thousands of pounds of explosives. When a 1,000-plane raid struck its target, it could drop roughly 8 million pounds of bombs in a single attack. German industry faced repeated destruction. The ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, aircraft plants at Regensburg, and synthetic fuel facilities essential for the German war machine. These bombing missions came at a high cost for American crews, who suffered heavy casualties. Yet the sustained pressure steadily crippled German war production. By the spring of 1944, German soldiers stationed in Normandy often watched long streams of American bombers flying eastward overhead on their way to strike Germany. Hundreds of aircraft, glittering in tight formations against the sky, symbolized the enormous industrial strength behind the Allied war effort. That same power would soon support the largest amphibious invasion ever attempted. By the time of the Normandy invasion, the Luftwaffe had lost the ability to challenge Allied air superiority over France. German troops already understood the consequences of enemy control of the skies. In North Africa, they had watched Allied aircraft relentlessly attack Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's forces. In Italy, fighter bombers had destroyed German supply columns on the roads. By 1944, Allied aircraft roamed freely across France, striking virtually any moving target. The Allies effectively owned the air. By that time, German leaders were certain that an invasion of Western Europe was coming. The only question was where and when it would occur. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt disagreed about the best defensive strategy, though both agreed that the invasion had to be stopped at the shoreline. If Allied forces secured a foothold and pushed inland, Germany lacked the resources to drive them back. Rommel argued that armored divisions should be placed close to the coast so they could launch immediate counterattacks. Von Rundstedt preferred keeping the tanks farther inland, ready to strike once the main landing site had been identified. Either plan might have worked under different circumstances, but both were limited by one critical factor: Allied air superiority. Rommel understood this reality better than most German commanders. Large-scale movements of tanks during daylight would attract devastating air attacks. In one of his assessments before the invasion, he wrote that fighting an enemy with total control of the air was like confronting modern armies while equipped with primitive weapons. His observation reflected hard experience from earlier campaigns. France to return home and celebrate his wife Lucy's 50th birthday the next day. Many German officers relaxed as well, assuming that an invasion could not happen immediately. German intelligence, however, intercepted important Allied signals. On June 1, and again on June 5, coded messages referencing lines from a poem by the French poet Paul Verlaine were detected. German intelligence chief Admiral Wilhelm Canaris had earlier identified these lines as signals indicating an invasion within 48 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Hermann Meyer alerted the German 15th Army and contacted both Rommel's and von Rundstedt's headquarters. He also sent messages to General Alfred Jodl, yet the warning failed to trigger a coordinated response. Jodl assumed von Rundstedt had already been informed. Von Rundstedt believed Rommel had received the message. Rommel himself either never saw the warning or was distracted by his trip home. As a result, the chain of command collapsed through a series of assumptions. Although the 15th Army was placed on alert, no decisive actions followed, and other commands were not properly warned. The only German forces with intelligence pointing clearly to an imminent invasion failed to react effectively because every level of leadership believed someone else had already handled the situation. Meanwhile, Allied meteorologists had discovered a brief window of slightly improved weather conditions on June 6. General Dwight D. Eisenhower made the final decision: the invasion would proceed. Before dawn on June 6, 1944, the operation began. Their objectives were crucial: capture bridges, disable German coastal artillery, and block reinforcements heading toward the landing zones. The airborne landings were chaotic. Strong winds and intense anti-aircraft fire scattered paratroopers over a wide area. Some soldiers landed in flooded fields and drowned beneath the weight of their gear. Others found themselves miles from their intended drop zones, forced to navigate through unfamiliar territory in darkness. Despite the confusion, small groups of airborne troops achieved several key goals. They seized bridges, sabotaged defenses, and blocked roads that might have allowed German forces to reach the beaches quickly. At 5:45 a.m., even before sunrise, Allied naval bombardment began. 84 warships, supported by numerous landing craft armed with rockets and guns, opened fire on German coastal defenses. The roar of artillery echoed continuously, shaking the ground and illuminating the early morning sky with flashes and explosions. The battleship USS Nevada, once damaged during the attack on Pearl Harbor, fired hundreds of massive 14-inch shells and thousands of smaller rounds at positions near Utah Beach. The British cruiser HMS Belfast and the battleship HMS Ramillies also delivered heavy bombardments during the campaign, pounding German fortifications with thousands of shells. For the German defenders, the bombardment was overwhelming. Concrete bunkers shook under repeated impacts, communication lines were destroyed, and many defensive positions were shattered by the relentless shelling. At 6:30 a.m., the first assault troops began landing on the beaches of Normandy. Strong currents pushed the American landing craft about 2,000 yards south of their intended location, unintentionally placing them in an area with lighter German defenses. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the 56-year-old son of former President Theodore Roosevelt, landed with the first wave of the 4th Infantry Division. Realizing they had landed off target, he reportedly declared, "We'll start the war from right here." The unexpected landing point, combined with effective naval gunfire and rapid movement inland, allowed American troops to advance quickly and link up with airborne forces. Fewer than 200 casualties occurred among the more than 23,000 soldiers who landed there. Omaha Beach, however, became the most dangerous and costly of all the landings. German defenses were stronger than Allied intelligence had predicted. The beach was defended by the experienced 352nd Infantry Division rather than the weaker coastal units the Allies had expected. High bluffs overlooked the shoreline, giving German machine gun crews excellent fields of fire. Rough seas also caused problems for the attackers. Many landing craft struggled in the waves, and several amphibious tanks sank before reaching shore. When the first waves arrived, they faced intense machine gun and artillery fire. Soldiers were pinned down behind beach obstacles and seawalls, while bullets and shells raked the sand. Reinforcements continued to arrive, but they were landing directly into a deadly zone of concentrated fire. For several tense hours that morning, it appeared possible that the assault at Omaha Beach might collapse entirely. Offshore commanders briefly debated whether to evacuate the surviving troops and redirect the next assault waves to different landing zones. Combat engineers worked under relentless fire to remove beach obstacles, suffering heavy losses in the process. Meanwhile, several U.S. Navy destroyers moved dangerously close to land, in some cases nearly running aground, in order to deliver precise gunfire against German defensive positions. Gradually, and at great cost, American troops forced their way beyond Omaha Beach and captured the high ground overlooking the landing area. By the evening of June 6, roughly 2,400 American casualties had been recorded there, but control of the beach had finally been secured. Elsewhere along the Normandy coast, British and Canadian forces encountered varying degrees of resistance at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. At Gold Beach, experienced British units faced moderate opposition, but ultimately overcame it. Juno Beach proved particularly challenging due to offshore reefs and strong defensive fortifications, yet Canadian troops advanced quickly inland once the shoreline was cleared. Sword Beach, the easternmost landing zone near Caen, saw determined German resistance. Nevertheless, British forces succeeded in establishing a stable beachhead. Above the battlefield, Allied dominance in the air was overwhelming. On D-Day, the Allies had 11,590 aircraft available. These included 3,455 operational heavy bombers, 989 medium and light bombers, and 3,824 fighter aircraft. On that single day, they carried out 14,674 sorties. By comparison, the German Luftwaffe could deploy only between 319 and 815 operational aircraft across all of Western France. The imbalance meant that roughly 37 Allied missions occurred for every single German sortie, of thousands. For the German troops defending Normandy, the spectacle in the sky was overwhelming. Allied aircraft filled the horizon in massive formations. Dive bombers destroyed defensive positions, while fighter bombers attacked German reinforcements moving along roads toward the front lines. The situation mirrored what Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had warned about earlier. Facing a modern enemy that fully controlled the skies was like fighting under the same disadvantages once experienced by indigenous warriors confronting industrial-era European armies. The scale of the invasion itself was staggering. The Allied fleet consisted of 6,939 vessels. Among them were 1,213 naval warships, 4,126 landing ships and landing craft, 736 support vessels, and 864 merchant ships. Nearly 195,700 naval personnel from multiple Allied nations operated this massive armada. By the end of June 6, between 156,000 and 160,000 Allied soldiers had landed in Normandy. Approximately 73,000 Americans and about 83,000 British and Canadian troops. The German defenders were stunned by both the size and coordination of the operation, something Nazi leadership had insisted the Allies were incapable of organizing. Germany technically maintained 58 divisions across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, totaling roughly 850,000 soldiers along more than 2,000 miles of coastline. As he ordered Colonel Hermann von Opplen-Bronikowski to launch a counterattack with the 21st Panzer Division. He reportedly declared bluntly that failure to drive the British back into the sea would mean losing the war. The 21st Panzer Division mounted the only German armored counterattack on D-Day itself. By around 8 p.m., elements of the division reached the coast between Juno and Sword beaches. For a brief moment, German tanks had achieved their objective. However, the attack lacked sufficient infantry support and reserves to exploit the breakthrough. Allied naval artillery quickly targeted any visible German movement. At the same time, the sudden arrival of roughly 250 Allied gliders behind German lines threatened their rear positions. By 9 p.m., the German armored units withdrew. Meanwhile, Adolf Hitler had slept late that morning. The armored reserves under his direct authority were not released until about 3 p.m., a delay of roughly 12 critical hours. This hesitation allowed Allied forces time to strengthen their beachheads. The divided German command structure, which both Rommel and Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt had previously criticized, crippled the response during the crucial opening phase of the invasion. When Rommel's chief of staff, General Hans Speidel, informed him by phone about the large Allied landings, Rommel repeatedly muttered in frustration while rushing back to Normandy, blaming himself for underestimating the timing. He arrived at headquarters around 10 p.m. that night. By then, more than 150,000 Allied troops were already ashore. The opportunity to repel the invasion had passed. Effective German counterattacks nearly impossible. On June 20, just 2 weeks after D-Day, Field Marshal von Rundstedt submitted a detailed 3,100-word report analyzing the situation. He identified Allied control of the air as the decisive factor. According to his assessment, around 29,000 Allied sorties had been flown within 2.5 days, reaching targets as far as 65 miles from the beachheads. Approximately 2,300 aircraft per day attacked German troop movements, often targeting even individual soldiers. Naval gunfire made daylight tank operations across open terrain extremely dangerous. Tactical bombers struck supply lines and reinforcements, causing severe losses in vehicles and transport columns and turning logistics into a serious crisis. By June 29, von Rundstedt's frustration reached its limit. When Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel asked him what Germany should do next, he responded bluntly, "Make peace, you fools." What else is there to do? Shortly afterward, on July 4, he was dismissed from command, officially because of age and poor health, though the real reason was his recognition that the Western War had become unwinnable. Subsequent reports from German commanders painted an equally grim picture. General Erich Marx, who had commanded the corps defending the invasion beaches, was killed on June 12 during an Allied air attack. He was later awarded the Oak Leaves to his Knight's Cross posthumously for his role during the first week of fighting, though in reality, German resistance only slowed an inevitable Allied advance. Rommel himself attempted to persuade Hitler that the Western Front could no longer be saved. The strafing run caused severe head injuries that forced him to withdraw from active command. On October 14, 1944, after being implicated in the July 20 plot against Hitler, Rommel was forced to take his own life. The famous Desert Fox, who had long recognized the growing strength of American military power and whose strategic warnings had often proven accurate, ultimately became a victim of the regime he had served. Ironically, von Rundstedt, dismissed for suggesting peace, was recalled in September 1944 as commander-in-chief in the West. Hitler had few remaining commanders with comparable experience, and the worsening situation demanded capable leadership despite doubts about political loyalty. Von Rundstedt remained in command during Germany's final major offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. The operation ultimately failed for the same reasons that had doomed German efforts since the Normandy landings: fuel shortages, limited air power, and overwhelming Allied material superiority. By May 1945, when Germany finally surrendered, the magnitude of American industrial production was impossible to ignore, even for the most devoted Nazi supporters. Allied armies occupied Germany from all directions. German cities had been devastated by years of bombing, the country's industrial base was shattered, and the Wehrmacht had effectively collapsed. Everywhere German soldiers looked, they saw Allied equipment in quantities that dwarfed anything Germany had produced during the war. Consumer goods could not produce military power on a large scale. These ideas were not merely propaganda, they shaped strategic thinking. Germany's intelligence services actually possessed accurate information about American industrial output during 1942 and 1943. Yet ideological assumptions led Nazi leaders to dismiss the evidence. They claimed American equipment would be inferior, American soldiers poorly motivated, and American society internally divided. Ideology acted as a filter that rendered contradictory facts insignificant. But on June 6, 1944, the reality could no longer be ignored. Over 150,000 troops landed from nearly 7,000 ships under the protection of more than 11,000 aircraft. Allied naval guns dominated the coastline, while air power suppressed any German attempt at maneuver. With air operations occurring at ratios of roughly 37-1, German forces were trapped under constant attack. American logistical capability soon demonstrated its scale as well. Within 82 days, over 400,000 tons of supplies were transported across France to sustain the advancing Allied armies. Rommel's earlier warnings proved remarkably accurate. Allied fighter bombers repeatedly struck German armored units, preventing large-scale tank movement exactly as he had predicted. In the end, the strategic argument between Rommel, who favored positioning armor near the coast, and von Rundstedt, who preferred holding it in reserve, became irrelevant. Allied air and naval superiority ensured that major German armored counterattacks were nearly impossible, regardless of where the tanks had been deployed. Policies rooted in racial persecution drove many brilliant minds out of the country. Numerous Jewish scientists who escaped Europe eventually contributed to the American war effort, including the scientific teams behind the Manhattan Project that developed atomic weapons. At the same time, Germany's own intelligence and research communities were weakened as skilled analysts, scientists, and codebreakers were removed or forced into exile because of racial laws. The ideological priorities of the regime also diverted valuable military resources. Units and logistical capacity that might have supported the front lines were instead committed to the machinery of genocide. In territories under German occupation, Nazi racial brutality produced the opposite of what German planners had hoped for. Instead of cooperation or voluntary labor, many populations turned toward resistance movements and partisan warfare, tying down German forces across Europe. In practice, nearly every element of Nazi racial thinking created strategic problems for the German war effort. Adolf Hitler's contempt for the United States grew from this ideological framework. From the perspective of Nazi racial theory, America appeared to be a fragile society, racially mixed, politically divided, and therefore incapable of sustained military power. German leadership predicted that the United States would struggle with industrial mobilization, suffer from social fragmentation, and prove ineffective on the battlefield. Events unfolded very differently. By the middle of 1944, the United States had demonstrated a level of industrial and military strength that German commanders could no longer ignore. Leadership. The society they had described as weak and divided had organized itself with remarkable efficiency. American industry, which German propaganda had often minimized, had produced vast quantities of ships, aircraft, vehicles, and weapons. Perhaps most striking to German soldiers was the composition of the Allied forces themselves. The troops arriving in Normandy represented every region of the United States and a wide variety of ethnic and cultural backgrounds, yet they fought with determination equal to that of their opponents. The landing in Normandy did not immediately end the war. Nearly another year of intense fighting followed before Germany finally surrendered in May 1945. German forces continued to resist with skill and discipline. Nevertheless, the overall outcome had effectively been decided. The combined industrial output and military resources aligned against Germany was simply too overwhelming. Once the Atlantic Wall had been broken and Allied armies had secured their foothold in France, the strategic situation shifted permanently. The invasion opened the way for the liberation of Western Europe. Allied armies would eventually advance across the continent until they met Soviet forces in Berlin, bringing the war in Europe to its conclusion. In retrospect, Hitler's earlier dismissal of the United States as a weakened and racially mixed nation became one of the most significant misjudgments of the war. His statement in early 1942 reflected a deeper flaw within Nazi ideology. The racial worldview at the core of the Third Reich prevented its leaders from recognizing the many sources of national strength. From the moment Hitler declared war on the United States in December 1941 until the Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944, German planners continued to believe that American limitations would prevent it from playing a decisive role in the European theater. Those years, however, allowed the United States to undertake one of the largest mobilizations in modern history. Factories expanded rapidly, shipyards operated around the clock, and military forces grew to unprecedented size. By the time Allied forces crossed the English Channel, they were supported by a logistical and industrial system on a scale that German planners had never fully believed possible. For the German soldiers watching the horizon that morning in June 1944, The sight of thousands of ships and aircraft represented a collision between propaganda and reality. Many had long accepted the idea that American society lacked the strength for such an operation. The armada approaching Normandy demonstrated the opposite. Some German commanders recognized the implications. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt reportedly urged political leaders to negotiate peace, recognizing that the material power of the Allies had reached a level Germany could no longer match. By that point, the consequences of ideological misjudgment were already irreversible. The broader lesson extends beyond the events of the Second World War. Strategic decisions built on rigid beliefs rather than accurate analysis can lead to disaster. When leaders dismiss evidence that contradicts their worldview, they risk making critical errors in judgment. Difficult and dangerous campaign. Their backgrounds were diverse, but their collective effort produced a powerful and effective fighting force. The German officers observing the Allied Armada in June 1944 were witnessing the consequences of years of ideological blindness. For more than 3 years, they had been assured that the United States lacked unity and endurance. Instead, they faced a coalition capable of mobilizing industrial and military strength on a scale that made German victory impossible. Within 3 years of Hitler's confident dismissal of America, even some of his own commanders understood that the war could not be won. The immense military capacity visible in the Normandy invasion had disproved the assumptions at the heart of Nazi thinking. History preserves this episode as a warning. Nations that begin to believe their own propaganda, ignore inconvenient facts, or judge their opponents through prejudice rather than careful analysis risk catastrophic miscalculation. In 1944, the horizon of Normandy was filled with ships and aircraft that revealed how completely those miscalculations had shaped Germany's fate. Ideology had confronted reality, and reality proved far stronger.